So one of the strange things about starting a lecture at 4 p.m. is you don't know how to greet everybody. Do we say good afternoon? But it's much after the noon hour. And we can't say good evening yet because it's not yet evening. So in any case, welcome. My name is Chirayu Bhatt and I'm your host for this inaugural lecture in the newly launched CEPT AU Lecture series. May I request Dr. Pankaj Chandra, Chairman of the Board of Management of Ahmedabad University, to say a few words about this new lecture series.
Universities are generally neutral grounds for scholarly conversations, and they're also congregations of the questioning. This is yet another opportunity for all of us to be part of this journey. This joint seminar that has been set up is a precursor to many activities that we hope to do together at Ahmedabad University and CEPT, and hopefully with many other excellent institutions that we have in the city. There are many things that we are planning as of now, to begin with opening up of many of our courses across the two schools, opening our programs and seeing what resources we could share with students and faculty that are both these institutions. And I hope that in times to come, as we understand the processes much better, we do understand each other much better, but as we understand our processes much better, we hope to offer joint degrees. We hope to hopefully get joint appointment for faculty and bring speakers like the one that we have today. Ahmedabad University is a very new institution. It's a young university which aspires to be a liberal education-driven center that is that would excel in both teaching and research in times to come. CEPT is a very reputed institution, a center that has excelled for long periods of time, and two of us jointly bring this lecture series together to you. So welcome to CEPT AU Lecture Series. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Chandra. May I call upon Dr. Bimal Patel, President of CEPT University, to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Christophe Jaffrelot.
So, thank you, Professor Chandra. Yes, indeed, we are looking forward to doing a lot of things together between Ahmedabad University and CEPT University. We have already started taking the first steps so that we can do things like this lecture series and students cross-registering, etc. But more about that as we go along. I have the privilege today of introducing Professor Christophe Jaffrelot. Professor Jaffrelot is an extremely important political scientist of our time, and his work is of special significance to us. He works on politics in India and Pakistan and is interested in nationalism and democracy, Hindu nationalism, caste mobilization in politics, and ethnic conflicts. For those of you who have not already looked him up on Wikipedia, his interest in India was kindled when he was still in school through a philosophy teacher well-versed in Indian philosophy. He visited India when he was 20 years old and has kept coming since then. Professor Jaffrelot received a diploma from the Paris Institute of Political Science, CERI-Sciences PO, as I believe it's called, in 1985. Then he received an MA in History from the University of Paris I, Sorbonne, in 1986. Advanced Study degree from the EHESS, also in 1986. He then studied at the National Institute of Oriental Languages and Civilizations. Professor Jaffrelot's PhD in political science is from CERI-Sciences PO also. Just so that we know, by the way, CERI-Sciences PO has produced many notable alumni in the fields of law, economics, philosophy, history, business, literature, media, and politics. 5 out of the last 6 presidents of France are alums from the same institute as his, and around 28 past or present heads of state have studied or taught at CERI-Sciences PO. So we have a visitor who's an alum of a very, very distinguished, very important organization. Professor Jaffrelot joined the French National Center for Scientific Research in 2002. From 97 to 2000, he was deputy director, and then up to 2008, he was director of Center for International Studies in Paris. CERI, as it is known, is the largest of Sciences PO's research units. It was established in 1952 with only a handful of scholars, and today it has grown to become the most important center for research in France, concentrating on both international, transnational relations and regional studies. Research at CERI is structured around 5 broad themes: security and risks, international politics, regional integration and globalization, states and political systems, identities, and politics. In addition to its research activities, CERI reaches out to policymakers and government agencies and various other institutions like media and NGOs, etc. Professor Jaffrelot has founded 4 book series. He has been editor-in-chief and director of the quarterly journal Critique International. He's member of the editorial boards of several journals, such as Asian Survey, International Political Sociology, and India Review. Since 2011, Professor Jaffrelot is Professor of Indian Politics and Sociology in the King's India Institute at the King's College London. Professor Jaffrelot is also permanent consultant at the Center for Policy Planning staff in the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs since 2008. He's president of the research group on emerging countries at Institut Montaigne. Hold on, there's a lot more coming. Member of the scientific councils of the South Asian Institute of Heidelberg, of the Center for the Study of Multi-Level Federalism, New Delhi, and of Ashoka University, also in New Delhi. He chairs the scientific council of 6 research centers. He's also president of political science section of the French National Committee for Science Research. Professor Jaffrelot was awarded the 1992 CNRS Bronze Medal. In 2014, he was awarded the Prix Brienne and the Prize of the Academy of Moral and Political Sciences for his Pakistan Syndrome, if I've got the title right. 2014 was a big year for him. He not only got these 2 awards, he got a 3rd one. He received the Ramnath Goenka Award for Excellence in Journalism. Professor Jaffrelot has published a large number of books on India and Pakistan. I'm not going to read out the whole list. There's 15. There's the Hindu Nationalist Movement in Indian Politics, published in 1996. Dr. Ambedkar and Untouchability, India's Silent Revolution, The Rise of the Lower Castes in North India. I'm skipping as I go along. This latest book, The Pakistan Paradox, is been much reviewed, and you might have heard of it. Professor Jaffrelot has taught at the Sciences PO and now at the King's College. He has taught courses on colonial India, India and the world, democracy in India, politics and society in Pakistan, Asian cities, Islam and politics in India and Pakistan, and religion and politics in India and Pakistan. He has been a visiting faculty member at Columbia University, Princeton, Johns Hopkins University, and Yale, amongst others. In the periods of rest that he gets, when he is not working, Professor Jaffrelot supervises PhD students and writes columns for the Indian Express and the Caravan. Before I request Professor Jaffrelot to commence, I would like to thank, on behalf of all of us, Ahmedabad University and CEPT University, I want to take this opportunity to thank all the wonderful high school teachers who equip young minds to think, teach them how to question, urge them to explore, and spur them to action. More particularly, I would like to thank that philosophy teacher who kindled your interest, Professor Jaffrelot, in India when you were in high school. India owes that teacher a big debt. Professor Jaffrelot, may I request you to deliver your lecture as the inaugural lecture in the AU CEPT lecture series. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for these warm words. Thank you for inviting me, Professor Chandra, Professor Patel, and of course, it's particularly important for me to be the first to speak in this series because I do believe in debates. I do believe in ideas and exchanges of ideas. And when two universities join hands for making these debates even more vibrant, vibrant is a word in this state that you have to use very cautiously, but still vibrant anyway, it's even better. I want to thank you, and I want to thank Howard Spodek for making all this possible, because Howard and I met 6 months ago, and that's when the idea of me presenting my research really was initiated. So thank you, Howard, for making this possible. Well, this research is now 12 years old. I'm coming, in fact, I came for the first time in Ahmedabad just after the earthquake, so it's more than 12 years now even. And I've done research in many different directions. Last direction is that one, trying to do some political economy, which is not my cup of tea at all, because I'm not an economist, but I'm a political scientist, and I have always considered that we cannot do justice to political dynamics without factoring in the economic dimension. So this is one somewhat peripheral area of interest for me, but of course a major subject for Gujarat and India at large. What do we mean by the Gujarat model? And in what sense is it a model? Well, I've looked for a definition. I've looked in different directions, and I could find one eventually in the book that Bibek de Broglie published in 2013, Gujarat, Governance for Growth and Development. And this definition comes in the last page of the book. That is, I'll read, it's a very short one. What is the Gujarat model then? It is one of freeing up space for private initiative and enterprise and the creation of an enabling environment by the state. So it's, if you go by this definition, a market-friendly kind of model. In the first section of this presentation, I will argue that it is as much about business friendliness as about market friendliness. And that will be the first argument I will make. And then in the second section, I'll try to look at the implications of this business/market friendly model. And I'll go, of course, more in the social direction at that point of my reasoning. Well, I have no time to go back in history, but of course, it is important to consider that the market/business friendliness of the Gujarat model did not begin in the 21st century. Gujarat has traditionally been market/business friendly. And till the 90s, that was somewhat contained, but after the 91 reform, it became even more legitimate. And then you see a shift. You know, the 90s may be the moment when things changed. The reason why I say that is because in 1990, the state government produced a new employment policy which aimed at guaranteeing employment in backward talukas and laid down that, I quote, 80% posts in new industries should go to local people and 50% posts of managerial and supervisory posts must go to local people too. That was an industrial policy that was still somewhat job-oriented. That was somewhat for the backward areas as much as for the local people in these areas. This changed in the mid-90s when you saw a new industrial policy focusing much more on attracting investments. No? That became the order of the day. That became the main driving force. And of course, that was something you saw even more clearly when the Gujarat Special Economic Zones Bill Act was passed in 2004, and even more clearly in the 2009 industrial policy that was published, that was publicized, and that was designed to, or for, I quote, making Gujarat the most attractive investment destination, not only in India, but also in the world. So the goal was to attract investments. And that policy targeted not only what we call the prestigious units, the units which were above 300 crores like in 91, but also what was known, or what started to be known as the mega industrial projects. And these mega industrial projects were 1,000 crore rupees large or more, and they had to employ 2,000 people, irrespective of the amount of the investment. So that was the end of a trajectory that started in the mid-90s. More for the investors, and that was reflected in the relaxation of the qualifications that was there before, which were there before, for jobs. For instance, when you say that you do not need to hire more than 2,000 people, whatever the amount of the investment is, no, you prepare the ground for the nano plant that was 38,000 crore investment, which is, of course, of a different magnitude. So that was something we saw gradually also in the fact that the conditionality of employment has been watered down substantially. Sorry to be a bit technical, but otherwise it makes hardly any sense. But in the early, and I prefer to repeat to be clear, in the early years of the 90s, it was mandatory for the beneficiary units of any subsidy to employ 100 permanent workers each, and to employ local workers. This condition of employing 100 permanent workers turned on into 100 regular workers, and then just 100 workers. So this is a trend there. So that's the first thing. Attracting investments became more important than create jobs. And I return to this because it's a very, very, very important qualification to the model. The second thing that was clear was that investors were attracted, had to be attracted by significant concessions in terms of tax deduction or other fiscal subsidies. If you look at the amount of such subsidies per year in terms of sales tax incentives or in terms of sales tax deferment, you jump, you multiply it by 5 times. If you compare the figures, the average figure of the decade 1990-2000 and the average figure of the years 2000-2007. From 1,250 crores rupees to 6,000 crores rupees. And what is also very important to note is that the average annual subsidy for 1 unit per unit rose from 3.37 crore in 2000 to 101 crore in 2010 per unit, which means that you have clearly a rise of the prestigious units or the mega prestigious units. There is a change, you can say, of degree, you can claim of nature of the kinds of investors who have been attracted. Incidentally, I'll return to that, but these subsidies, fiscal subsidies, resulted in the state giving up 40% of its main source of revenue, fiscal revenue, which is quite a message. in empirical terms. So that was the second important pillar of the model. The third one was, of course, access to land. And land is a major issue everywhere in India, and even more in a state like Gujarat, where urbanization is particularly rapid. There, of course, we can compare again figures, and for instance, the figures of the land that was acquired by the GIDC in 1990/2000, 4,000 hectares. During the subsequent decade, 21,000 acres. So the amount of land acquired by the state for redistributing to entrepreneurs had jumped significantly. Of course, part of this policy was built on the SEZ policy. And Gujarat has been the state where SEZs have multiplied over the last 15 years more than anywhere else. You have probably a density that is higher than anywhere else. And these SEZs are important, and again I would like to cite Vivek de Broglie because of many reasons, including, as he says, I quote, the fact that the attractiveness of SEZs in Gujarat had quite a bit to do with the SEZs Act's provision on the labor market. For example, there is easier exit, more flexible provisions on hiring and terminating labor, and the concept of fixed-term employment. That's one dimension of the SEZ. Land is the other one. Land is another one. And access to land has been particularly clear in cases like the Mundra SEZ or the other places on the seaside where the CAG, by the way, has identified some estimation of the price of land, because when the market price was something like 1,500 rupees a square meter, the price that was charged was between 1 and 32 rupees for a square meter. And that was a report of the CAG, the Controller and Auditor General, that was published in 2009. But it's not only with SEZ that you have this kind of land policy. You saw that also, of course, when the nano plant was built, because Tata Motors did not pay the market price at all, and that's why it's not a market-friendly policy. If it was market-friendly, you would have to pay the market price for the land. It's as basic as that. So it's something different. It's something different that is, I think, a growth model. It's a growth model. And it works pretty well so far as growth is concerned. Because as a result of this policy, Gujarat has been able to attract a record number of investors. So the figures are astonishing. Foreign direct investment to begin with, FDIs. If you look at the vibrant Gujarat moment every 2 years, of course there is a big difference between the proposed investments and the actual investments. But still, in the beginning, when 57% or even 35% of the proposed investments materialized, that was a huge addition to the investments in Gujarat. In the end of the story, it's not so good. But the first events were truly remarkable. But even more than foreign investment, what we saw was a surge in domestic investment. And it's not easy to add up what has been invested in Gujarat over the last 15 years domestically, because you don't need so many clearances as for FDIs. But there is one figure you can use for measuring the investments. And this is fixed capital. You know, if you can measure the kind of fixed capital that has been added in Gujarat, you have a good idea of investments. And the fixed capital has been multiplied by 4 in 5 years. In 5 years, the machine tools, any fixed capital between 2005 and 2010 has been multiplied by 5. I'll give you the exact figure later on, but the point that I want to make here is that, yes, investments developed a lot. And that was good for growth, because these investments resulted in a very high growth rate. You know, there is no dispute, there is no way you can dispute the fact that over the last decade, even if you compare with some of the most dynamic Indian states, Gujarat comes number 1. Growth was there. Growth has significantly improved over the last 10 years. And that has resulted also in a remarkable growth of the per capita income. Because, of course, if you divide the state GDP by 60 million or so, you arrive at a remarkable figure. I can't give you the whole list because it's a long list. In fact, you could see it till the end if you want. But whatever the state you use as for comparing Gujarat with others, with 50,500 rupees, Gujarat is way ahead of the, we'll give you the figure, it will be easier, Indian average, that is 38,000. So the per capita revenue in Gujarat is almost twice the national per capita revenue. It's lagging behind only very few states, and sometimes very small states, or sometimes Maharashtra, which is at 64,000 rupees, because in Maharashtra there is Bombay. So you can't compare really. So that's another remarkable achievement. So in that sense, we have a model. It's a growth model. And the question that I'm going to turn to now in this second part of the presentation is to look at the implications beyond growth. What else do we need to factor in? Well, the first thing we need to factor in is jobs. Because we have heard so many times that in some places in the world today, we have jobless growth. And certainly this is one of the problems this model is encountering. It's encountering this problem for many different reasons. First of all, because of the kind of industry that has grown the quickest in Gujarat. Petrochemicals production, chemical productions, both represent almost 52% of the total output. You know, chemicals and petrochemicals do not create jobs. They certainly create growth, and they certainly require huge investments. But there is a disconnect between the kind of industry that has been promoted and the kind of job creation that has been necessary, so to speak. So that's one explanation. Another explanation, of course, is the fact that when you try to attract big companies, you try to attract highly capital-intensive industries. And here I'd like to compare two models, so to speak, Gujarat and Tamil Nadu. Only 4 figures, and you will understand what is at stake there. In 2013, Gujarat represented 18% of the fixed capital of India. This small state of 60 million people represented 18% of the fixed capital of India. But only 9% of the factory jobs. You go to Tamil Nadu, and you see a state which represents only 16%, only 9% of the fixed capital, 9.8%, and 16% of the jobs. It's a different model. Because on the one hand, you have big companies, highly capitalistic, and on the other hand, you have a more decentralized, a more SMEs, small and medium industries oriented model. And that's, of course, one of the problems of the model. Where are the SMEs? That was one of the main resources of Gujarat. You know, the entrepreneur, the entrepreneurial skills of so many groups, including the Patels, who have come to and become entrepreneurs in the 20th century before many other groups coming from the landed communities. Well, the SMEs have been more or less the collateral casualties of the model. And I would like to give you only two figures to illustrate that, and they are very recent figures, so we are now reaching the nowadays situation. First, the decline of the credit that the banks gave to the SMEs. The SMEs, or micro and small, medium enterprises, MSMEs, if you want to bracket them all together, received 13% of the gross bank credit in 97-98. Only half of that 6 years later, 6%. So when you do not get the credit for sustaining your growth or invest, of course you enter a crisis. And this is exactly what we saw in a very recent and interesting report by the Institute of Small Enterprise and Development and by the Gujarat Industrial Development Corporation. So the GIDC itself produced 2 years ago a report saying that the non-performing assets of the SMEs has grown by 40.9%, 43.9%. Basically, many of these SMEs are getting bankrupt. And that's something we also heard last year from, I'll return to that, from the ministry, the Union Ministry of MSMEs, who said that 48,000 units were sick in Gujarat, and this is only second to Uttar Pradesh. This is the state where the number of sick units among the MSMEs is the largest. That's part of the dynamic I was showing. And why that is connected to jobs? MSMEs are, of course, better to create jobs than big enterprises. But of course, the question is not only the number of jobs, it's also the question of quality of jobs. And here you have another interesting dimension, that is the informalization of work in this state. Because again, if you compare to other states, and I will look only at urban jobs. Well, the urban informal sector, which means that you have contract laborers there only. The percentage of informal jobs in the urban sector of Gujarat has grown from 74% in 2004 to 81% in 2009, when it has decreased everywhere else. That's very interesting. Everywhere you see a decline of the informal sector. Tamil Nadu from 76 to 74, Maharashtra from 72 to 61, and the whole of India has reduced this percentage from 74 to 68. So here you have another dimension, the informalization of work that, of course, has resulted in low wages. And this is the last table I'd like to show. Yeah, this is based on the NSS survey data of 2011. If you look at the casual worker, other than public work, the average wages per day is in Gujarat at 144 rupees, much below the national average, and only UP and Chhattisgarh are doing more badly. this is an interesting comparison that we can also document by looking at other figures, but I'll skip these other tables. Yeah, for instance, this is even more recent. You look at the workers known as directly employed, and you see that in Gujarat, for instance, men receive 203 rupees when the average Indian received 305 rupees. And if you compare the public sector and the private sector, you see a big difference. 876 rupees in the public sector and 274 rupees in the private sector. Well, why do Patel ask for government jobs? Here is the response. There is a real disconnect between what you earn in a government job and what you earn in a private company. And in a private company, it's not so bad elsewhere. It's also because you have migrants coming from Orissa, coming from Bihar, coming from so many places, but it's not the only reason. It's part of the growth model. What is also part of it, and I'll close on that, almost. What is also part of it, of course, is, as I said, the fiscal revenues are not as great as they could be because of the fiscal subsidies which are given to the big companies. As a result, you see two things. You see, first of all, debt. Gujarat is very heavily indebted. The total amount of the debt, of the internal debt, represents something like 76% of the budget, and in 2013, the government has raised fresh loans of 26,000 crores for largely for paying the existing interest of the debt. It's not so critical given the ratio that is the most important figure to keep in mind, debt to GDP. The debt to GDP ratio is still at 21%. A state can live with this kind of ratio so long as growth remains. The moment growth stops or declines, then your debt remains and you don't have the revenues. So it's not such a problem up to that point. But that's the first implication of the fiscal subsidies. The other implication, of course, is that there is very little money left for social expenditures. And social expenditures are of very different categories. Some of them are only for vote bank politics and useless. Others are very important, and education and health are the most important expenditures that should be there. And again, it's not something new. This is a very interesting graph that has been made by Alexander Lee in Rochester University, showing that the percentage of social expenditures in Gujarat has started to fall, well, in fact, in the mid-80s. And what happened in the mid-80s, what happened in 85 in Gujarat is still haunting the polity of the state. There is a recovery, interestingly, during the first decade of the 21st century, but we are still below 40%, much below, in fact. We are at something like 38% of the expenditures which are social expenditures. Among these social expenditures, the most important one is, of course, education. And if you go by the RBI figures, which is somewhat tedious as an exercise, and compile the figures one year after another, you see that almost every year, only one state is doing less than Gujarat, and that is Madhya Pradesh, because Gujarat is not spending more than 13% of its budget on education, when India as a whole is spending 15%. So education has never been a priority in spite of the the high per capita revenue that I have mentioned. This is a unique disconnect, this kind of gap between the money spent on education and the growth rate of the state. So these are the two implications, and therefore I would like to close with a very balanced conclusion, as it has to be. On the one hand, we have a model. We have a model that is a growth model, a model that has been very successful in attracting investments, in promoting growth, and in making the state one of the richest in terms of per capita revenues. On the other hand, and that's where we agree to disagree, there is certainly a kind of liability in this model, because in terms of the numbers of jobs, the quality of jobs, the social expenditures that it allows, there is a question mark. How sustainable can this model be? How far can you not hire the young people who come on the labor market every month? How far can you do that? There is certainly a limit. You can probably resist the pressure from below for some time, but the sustainability of the model is what bothers me. And I'd like to end on this, because I'm sure we'll have now a debate that will have to be short, because I'll have to leave you to take a night bus at 6, but till 6 we can talk. Thank you. Oh, it's not medical, it's all, oh, you want the figures for health? The figures, I don't have the whole series like for, on the front of health is not as bad as on the front of education. Let me give you the figures. I have aggregates, but they are useful enough. Let me find them.
Sir, my question is...
Yeah, if you look at the Gujarat ranked number 6 out of 20 major states in per capita expenditures on health in 2001, but it with 163 rupees per capita. 10 years later, it was number 16 with 293 rupees per capita. Yeah. So, but, well, education, it was number 17, so it's marginally better. Yeah, if you look at the ratio, number of doctors per inhabitant, if you compare Gujarat and Tamil Nadu, the ratio is 1 to 10. Yeah, it's a real difference.
Yeah, my question is based on today's lecture. Now we see the polity of the state, Gujarat state, and the economy of the Gujarat state. Both actually capitalizes on each other, and there seems to be a strong nexus between both. That the politicians are capitalizing on the economic achievements, and businessmen are making use of the polity. So do you see that this state is a polity-driven economy or an economy-driven polity? How do you see it, political scientist?
I can take more questions. I'll take them down.
Other question?
I would like to know the number of landlessness, the number of people who become landless in last 10 years or 20 years, has it increased, or what has happened?
Hi, Christophe. Rupam here from Reuters. Good to see you in Gujarat.
Yeah.
I missed a bit of it, but just to get a quick understanding, why are you keen to revisit a model which you had already said that it had moments of success at one point of time? Is there a analysis which you really want to present all over again? Thank you.
I may begin with this question that is a kind of generic question. Well, it's certainly a good time to do it. And I think I made the decision unconsciously, possibly, to do it in August this year, when the question of reservations resurfaced in a completely different perspective. No, the people who were fighting reservations were asking for reservations, basically. What had happened? And what had happened is this for me. You know, the problem is that you have people who have expectations and to whom jobs are good jobs are not given in a sufficient number. And this is the result of a policy, of a trajectory. So that's a moment when economic policies and political economy reaches social contradictions. And that's where the political scientist has to intervene. And it's not something you should leave in the hands of the economists. So that's why I try to gather the data and make the points I've just made in front of you, and I hope that will indeed help, but I'm not so sure. Crony capitalism is the question you are asking about. No, this is clearly the question. At the same time, in a way, Gujarat has always cultivated crony capitalism. Yeah, it's nothing, there's nothing new there. Look at Shimanbhai Patel, look at even, you know, you have to go, even if you go back to the 60s, it's there. Interestingly, at that time, the nexus you're mentioning is somewhat a productive nexus in the sense that the players on the corporate sector side are not that big. They are textile entrepreneurs. Textile is hiring a lot of people. Textile is, of course, labor intensive. Diamond barons are hiring also a lot of people. This is, again, a very labor intensive kind of job. You shift to petrochemicals, it's a different story. You have to turn to big players who do not leave you as much room for maneuver. So I would say it's more a difference in degree than a difference in nature. If you want to look at this in perspective, you can read the book by Atul Kohli, which shows that, or the book by Asima Sinha. No, they both show that Gujarat did so well because of crony capitalism. And it's not only politicians and businessmen, it's also the bureaucrats. Bureaucrats are part of this triangle. But it's a different kind of crony capitalism because it's not with such big players who can dictate their terms and who will hire a minimal number of people. How many people do you need in a refinery? You know, you have just to press on a couple of buttons. I'm exaggerating, but it's a different kind of industry. Landlessness, really, I have not the figures. I would refer you to a very interesting research that had been made by Nancy Lobo, and I don't have it now in mind, but Nancy did a very interesting study of landlessness among tribals, because this is the main casualty of this problem. But I can't give you any figure, sorry.
Where does Gujarat stand in employment generation?
That's exactly what I was saying. So I can, well, return to it. You know, I know it's not easy to follow all these figures. No, you're right. I've not given these figures. Now I can give you these figures. That's the growth rate of employment has declined from 2.4% in the period 1999-2005 to 0+1%, which is almost stagnation, from 2004 to 2010. So that's also an interesting figure, because it shows that the moment when growth accelerates, job generation declines. Because that's the moment when you have, you remember, the highest rate of growth. So you have an invert correlation. And one of the problems also is that in terms of quality of jobs, you see that the jobs which have been created are more informal than formal. Yeah. And the main problem is, what do you do with the people who are leaving the village, come to a semi-urban or urban area, and are not even qualified for any of these jobs? That's also why you have automation. It's not only because it's highly capitalistic by itself, it's also because you need the qualified manpower. And if you have no education, how can you have a qualified manpower? Therefore, you have more highly capitalistic investments, and you do not generate jobs. So this spiral is really devastating. Yes?
Do you see some relationship between this growth model or the Gujarat model and some kind of urban-rural divide taking place, which has been, many people feel, reflected in the recent panchayat elections? That's number one. And number two is, do you find a relationship between this model and the Patel reservation legislation which happened recently? Do you find some connectivity?
I will repeat myself. That's not a problem.
I have a connected question.
Okay.
Can I ask you? Do you think that the sudden upsurge in the Patel community over the reservation issue can be directly or indirectly linked to the decline of the SMEs?
Of the SMEs?
SMEs,
Yeah.
which are basically controlled by them. And another question is that you have not yet factored in the role of the various religious sects. Various religious sects which operate in Gujarat and which control billions of money, source of which is basically from these SMEs as well as other. So what is their role of the religious sects and the assets controlled by them, which is virtually a parallel economy in Gujarat?
These are very good questions. And the first one on the rural-urban divide is something I'm working on right now. You know, to compile these figures is quite a task. What I've reached so far as a conclusion, if you use the monthly per capita expenditures that the NSS are tabulating, and if you look at the percentage of expenditure you can afford as an average in a village and you can afford as an average in a city, you have from 1993 to 2009 a gap that grows from 34% to 67%, which means that the gap between the per capita expenditures in the village as an average has been twice smaller than what it is in a city. And that's the only way you can measure the evolution, because revenues will not do. We don't know who earns what. But the monthly per capita expenditures will tell you what you can afford to spend. It's true all over India. It's not. What is not true all over India is that it was much better before. No, in the late 80s, the peasants, if you compare the peasants of Gujarat to the peasants of the rest of India, were much richer. And now they're not so. So the trend has been not in their favor, which is an interesting transformation. Now, of course, we have also the problem of how do you manage with the post-Narmada boom, you know? For 10 years, the Narmada water has helped a lot, and there is now a kind of saturation point that has been reached, and we'll see what kind of crops we'll get this year. But the trend is not that good. So yes, it's part of this question. Of course, this is correlated to the Patel issue, because Patels, of course, are still largely rural, and therefore, even when they migrate to the city, they keep in touch with the village, and this is related to your question, sir. The Patel movement, for me, is indeed one of the symptoms of this contradiction, because jobs is what is needed, and there are expectations in what was known as the neo-middle class. You know, what are the neo-middle class if not something made by fresh migrants who have high expectations and come to the city for get a better life? And if they don't get that, because there is no good jobs, then there is frustration, and of course, it's a problem. In the case of the Patel, I think there are two additional factors. One is that it's a dominant caste in the village. How can you not be treated in a better manner when you're not in the village? There is, again, a disconnect that is difficult to accept. And secondly, education is not their main asset. And therefore, if you miss that, it's even more difficult to get access to good jobs. And they have paid a lot for having a degree, which is not necessarily education. So it's even worse, because you are running into very heavy debts, your diploma is not worth what it should, and there is no job on the top of it. Whoa. Then you are really facing, and you're right, there is this problem of their entrepreneurship curtailed somewhat, because they are not as supported as they used to be as entrepreneurs. Of course, you have the Surat diamond barons and so on, but very few Patels or the pharmaceuticals people. But really, it is the tip of the iceberg. The mass of the Patels are not that well off. They may be dominant, but they may not be that well off. And last but not least, look at the sex ratio. It's a very important, I think, variable in that particular case. The sex ratio is not very good. The parents of the girls can afford to choose, and they would choose someone who has a government job, if they can. Of course, it makes a lot of sense. You saw the difference in terms of salary as an average, and of course in terms of security. So all this take them towards reservation, which is of course no solution, everybody knows. But if you can make the system derail by asking for reservation, then it's a good game to play. Because the end of the game may be no reservation for anybody. Yes, Rita.
So Christophe, maybe I'm sort of thinking aloud as I ask you this question. For some reason, when I read the topic, I sort of assumed, for fair or unfair reasons, that you were using the Gujarat model of development in its wider sense, in its broader sense, as something, whether it has an applicability to a larger context. And so, for instance, in our travels outside Gujarat, you constantly encounter people who are using the Gujarat model of development, sometimes in earnestness, sometimes in jest, but clearly as a phrase, as a metaphor that has sort of gone beyond Gujarat. So I was wondering if you could comment on its wider applicability or desirability as a larger model.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for an interesting lecture that we had. You told us the story about how the model is about growth and not really about development. About growth and not so much about development. And then you also told us about how the expenses that the state is making is not so much on to the social expenditure, which should be increased. At the same time, parallelly, what is happening is this growth is being fueled by actually the large private investments which are coming to the state. So what is the state doing? Where are the revenues that are coming to the state going out? On what expenses? Could you just tell us a little bit about that?
I will tell you what I know. Sorry.
I have a question. This Gujarat model has I think following up from the previous question, has stuck as a model in discussions. Do you think it's media creation rather than really a model? One, though it does give us this, there has been this discussions ongoing, and you must be aware about Bhagwati versus Sen and etc. about human development first or growth first. And we see Kerala where human development first happens and it gets translated into growth, because now we see it having the highest per capita income as well as high growth rates. It was expected in Gujarat that high growth rate will translate into human development because of this curve probably going up. It's gone to 42%, but not necessarily it's getting expended the way it should be expended. So what is your take on, is this too much media creation about Gujarat model, and there is no translation of economic growth into human development? Because we look at the data now of the infant mortality rate in rural Gujarat, it continues to be one number higher than rural Bihar for last about 1.5 decades. So that improvement is not seen in terms of performance on outcomes of this expenditure. So the second question is that why, even if these expenditures are there, as you see, and they're picking up, why they're not getting translated into outcomes? And that has to be sort of linked to the way expenditures are made, for what expenditures are made, and growth getting reflected in human development is translated into human development is not happening in the state now for last 2 decades that we have been following the data.
Yeah, I'll begin with this very important question, and it is fresh in our mind. Of course, I don't mean to say at all that you need to spend more on social expenditures by definition. No, there are so many expenditures which are useless. The state is sometimes spending lavishly on non-functioning institutions. And therefore, what is more needed is not, and I should have said that, more money. It's a reform of the state apparatus. But that's where political, will and public policies matter a lot. If you have some will politically, instead of emptying the state out, do reform the state and make it functioning. That was, by the way, the motto of one of the recent op-eds by Pratap Banu Mehta that was so interesting. After so many years, this coming back of the state in the picture is, for me, very interesting, because it means that there are things only the state can do, but the state has to be reformed for doing it. I know no country where education has been only private. It's not a model that we've seen elsewhere. It may be invented here, but the state has to do the education work. And for that, you need not only money, you need teachers, you need a proper education system, you need a state reform, and that's where the energy should be invested. That's my personal assumption. Media creation, I don't know, because the media has, well, it's too easy to say, well, because of the media. Certainly, they could have investigated more, always. But no, I think it's also a reflection of a kind of ideological vacuum. Well, we have tried so many things. Let's try that, because we don't have tried that so far. Now, of course, that's why it's so important for me to take it, to talk about that. What else can be tried? Taking some lessons from that and some lessons from what we have done before. And a third way, in that sense, could be created. But I would not blame the media only for this idea. Where is the money going? Well, if I knew. Well, there is one direction where the money goes for sure. Roads, electricity, and I should have mentioned that before. Infrastructure. When the state spends some money in Gujarat, it will spend more of its money in these directions than other states. And that's good, of course, for those who can benefit from that. But it's not the whole story for sure. Well, is this model something you can replicate? That's a very, well, timely question in a way. I think as a growth model, if you try to replicate that in other states, you will be facing two problems. The first one is there are very few states where inequalities can be sustained for so long without social movement. You try that in, well, you'll figure out where. And it's not workable. So that's, in a way, this is a kind of American model. You know, it's not at all a European model, where inequalities have to be contained. Here there is a kind of toleration for inequality that has been, well, working. Also because you expect that next year will be better, and it is. So expectations are somewhat met, never fully met, but somewhat met. The problem comes when, and that's what happened in August, there is a sense of desperation because you don't see the next year better than the actual year. And that's where but till then, till 2015, it was certainly an inequality-based model that was sustainable. The other thing that is not easy to replicate is, well, how many refineries can you build? You know, you will not have 20 refineries in 20 deep sea ports all over India. That's not possible. It's not needed. So if you have concentrated your investments in one state, you do not need to concentrate them elsewhere again. And this is the problem India is facing today with growth of exports falling by 30%. Well, even the actual capacities in Gujarat are too much. So how can you invest elsewhere when you do not even need to produce more? So for these two reasons, I don't think it is easy to replicate the model elsewhere. But certainly, there are things you can learn from the model. And I think, for instance, the reform of the electricity sector. You know, state electricity boards in many states need to be reformed. And it has to be painful. So these kind of things can be probably learned from the experience of Gujarat. But the whole package will be very difficult to transfer elsewhere, I think.
Hello. I was wondering how much this model is influential on the nation level. Of course, we have a similar government now on the nation level as in the state level, and I was wondering if there's any relationship between that, if there are people getting influenced by the Gujarat model on the level of the whole of India. If you would know anything about that.
My question is not so much related to what has been presented, but I would like to know your reflections on whether the state of politics or the state of political representation in this state has anything to do with the kind of redistribution of economic growth that has happened. And if it has, then your reflections on the model on the state of politics in Gujarat.
Well, this is a point about, in the course of your lecture, somewhere you made a distinction between business and markets. And I don't know how far you're trying to build on that distinction. Are you trying to look at the market as a social institution and not make a distinction between markets and inequality? Rather, look at inequality and equality as part of markets as a social institution itself, and how it's working in Gujarat.
I begin again with this last question because, of course, this is key. And this is key in the debate between Jagdish Bhagwati and Amartya Sen. I mean, the Dres Sen on the one end and Bhagwati Panagaria book on the other end. Because on the one end, you have this idea that, of course, if market regulates the competition between economic players, you maximize your investments. Well, we know that it is never true, because you have never free market enterprises or economies. But for the liberals, the closer you are to this model, the better. And therefore the question, and I don't disagree with that. I mean, few people would disagree with that. But the question is, how do you define a free market economy? You know? What is the tipping point when you can say, yes, now we are in a free market economy? And my argument here is that we are not, because few players are in a kind of oligopolistic position and are therefore in a position to extract a rent, which distract or destroy, even disrupt the market mechanisms. I would be very happy to see market mechanisms functioning when land has to be sold to big companies, because then you would have a maximization of the collective interest. We are not in this situation. I mean, there are so many instances that there is a distortion. So the argument that can be made is not that we are not against market economy. We are for market economy, but a market economy that is not based on oligopolistic structures. That's the argument, of course, liberals can't object to. And the problem is that they argue by saying, well, we are in a market economy, blah, blah, blah. And that's where we go nowhere. That's why economists can't be the only people interfering in this debate. I hope I'm making this point clear, but you can look at other, I take land, but you can look at other collective goods. How do you allocate gas, oil, electricity provision in one city? Is it a free market-based bid, or is it oligopolistic or sometimes monopolistic policy? Well, it's even worse when it is monopolistic. Now, why have the Americans invented the anti-cartel laws? To survive as a capitalist economy. Without any anti-cartel laws, capitalism is dead. And that's where, in fact, I can link to the previous question. Because if you try to think in terms of redistribution and wonder how you correlate the kind of state politics we have and redistribution, we fall back on forms of clientelism always, forms of patronage always. So you can have a clientelistic policy vis-à-vis the crony capitalist. You can have a clientelistic policy vis-à-vis your vote bank. And therefore, redistribution remains always politically overdetermined. And the problem here is, where are the independent institutions? Where is the state? The state cannot be depending upon political affiliations, political patronage, clientelistic relations. No, it has to be above. And it's exactly what I would say the first promoters of Indian democracy and the Indian Republic tried to do, to emancipate the state from social forces and redistribute according to other criteria. And of course, that did not happen.
There was the last question about
yeah. Oh, yeah. Can you repeat your question if you don't mind, because I'm not sure I got the point. You were far away, and I know it has something to do with the fact that in Delhi and in Gandhinagar there are people of the same party. Is that the story?
Somewhat, yes. I was wondering if there is on the nation level, if there are people that see the Gujarat model also as somewhat applicable for the whole of India in some way, and because also the similarity in government that is currently?
Yeah. No, certainly, I mean, well, the Make in India motto is certainly something that you can relate to the Gujarat model very easily, because Vibrant Gujarat was the institution that was supposed to attract foreign investors, and therefore the Make in India model or program goes in the same direction. Similarly, the Make in India model focuses on industrialization, the same way Gujarat has focused on industrialization, and not so much on the services. You know, the services are not so developed here compared to Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, Maharashtra. It's an industry-driven economy. And the Make in India program is similarly intended to attract investors in the industry or in the industry. Now, you know, it's too early to say whether this is a relevant strategy. It may be if investors in China find labor cost too high for them and therefore reorient their investments towards India. It has started. In fact, we have seen a movement in that direction. Look at the figures of the first semester. India is #1 in terms of FDIs in the world. $36 billion invested in India, 31 only in China, and 29 plus in the US. Wow. And partly because people have shifted from China to India. But there are two caveats. First, it's not because you invest that you create jobs, and I'm a bit obsessed, but I do think that the key problem for India is job creation. No, you can't develop without giving jobs to people when you have a population that is increasing at the rate of 16 million a year. If you don't create jobs for the youth, you can't develop really. So that's the first question, the first caveat. Will these big investors create jobs? And secondly, is these investments sustainable? You know, as I said, the capabilities, the capacities of the factories of India are not used because they are idle, because the exports markets are down. And so how far will these people continue to invest if they don't need to produce? But it may work, and we may see a kind of Chinese model becoming relevant, and therefore it would be a kind of adaptation of the Gujarat model in the sense that, well, India would not be only the office of the world, but also the workshop of the world. Let's see. You know, things have changed so much. We don't need so many manufactured products these days. The demand is low everywhere. So if it continues, if the demand is so low, why should we produce so much? Yeah.
You talked about Tamil Nadu and comparison with Gujarat.
Yeah.
The dominant industry structure is very different, right, in both these two states. If you see Tamil Nadu led by electronics, led by digital, IT, both these two sectors which are very science and technology driven, completely missing in Gujarat. Now, do you see this difference as an inability of the state to strategize, or inability of the industrial segment to look at opportunities that are incredibly growing
in the IT? Yeah.
How do you see the future of SMEs with respect to the Gujarat development model?
Putting aside the Gujarat model, which, as you admitted, has been distorted by the remnants of the license permit Raj. Its potentialities have never been fully realized. What are the chances of an alternative model, employment-oriented and equality-oriented? Are there any political chances of such a model being adopted even partially? Say more factories where semi-skilled and unskilled people can find employment. I know the Land Act comes in the way, but are there chances?
Well, I will connect the two last questions because the SMEs issue is very much connected to your question, sir. I think the chances are there, you know, to make more room, to give more loans to SMEs is certainly an alternative to the existing unbalanced system that we see. That requires political will and the will to emancipate politics from money.
Politics from?
Money. But this is a big if. Because this is the end of the crux of the matter, eventually. Which may mean that even the electoral laws may be reformed, may need to be reformed. You know, the expenditures for elections, all this it's part of the same story. So this is certainly the way I would go. To give again a priority to small and medium industries. Yes, Tamil Nadu is a very interesting, success story in terms of IT and also in terms of industry, because I see many French companies going there now, and I realize that it's for, again, electricity, against road, against... Yeah. But why has Gujarat not been able to develop the IT sector? Because indeed, when you look at the per capita revenue, when you look at it's in the same league as Karnataka, as Tamil Nadu, as states where it has been an important driving force. Here again, I think education is part of the story. And not only education, but English as a medium of education. I forget when English starts in the Gujarat school system, but I remember that I realized that it starts later than in many other southern states, where fluency in English comes earlier and is somewhat better. So, in fact, there was a study by McKinsey saying that one of the reasons why we don't develop IT in Gujarat is because the proficiency in English is not as good as elsewhere. It's quite plausible. So, there is a huge room for maneuver, room for improvement there, because Gujarat should attract IT investors for sure. Yeah. Yes, maybe we'll bracket them all together. Huh?
Yeah.
Thanks, sir. I don't know how connected with your lecture. My question is, you told about Patel things and all. So I'm quickly reminding myself about Middle East revolutions and all. So do you think something related to Middle East revolutions and all? Because there was a problem of employment and unemployed youth and everything. And you are connecting here Patel movement with unemployment and all these things. So do you think this is the start or something just started? Thank you.
So do you think the presence of, the absence of unions in Gujarat and the presence of unions in southern states have some impact on this thing, like the quality of jobs and everything?
Hello. I wanted to ask that vibrant Gujarat model has been started to replicate in other states, Resurgent Rajasthan, Bengal Industry Summit. So do you think it is healthy even for the investments in this country when every state starts doing this investment attracting things? Secondly, why I feel that you said that Make in India is towards industrialization and it won't create jobs. I wanted to know that investment in the field of renewable energies, alternate forms of energy, why won't they create jobs? And this would actually help India.
Can I just ask one more short question? Do you think the Gujarati diaspora has any role to play in the Gujarat growth model?
My question is regarding the aspirational kind of upwardly mobile middle class. This class buys Gujarat model, and this is the reason why this class has voted this party to power, the proponent of the model. how do you think this model, if you're talking about the failure of the model, then how do you think it's going to, impact this upwardly mobile middle class?
My question is about the act of representation and its influence on the Gujarat model. From representation in media, which has already been spoken about, representation through branding, representation through the political name association. How has the act of representation affected the model and its relevance?
I have two questions. I would have liked to hear a little more about agriculture and the agriculture sector in Gujarat. And secondly, when you talk about the Gujarat model, it articulates itself supposedly as an economic model. But does it also, without acknowledging and without saying, articulate itself as a social and a political model also?
Last question.
Corollary to that question, that last question, I would like to ask that Gujarat also has a lot of resistance which has not been incorporated into media and in your discussion at all, because we are also the state which has stalled the imposition of Maruti Suzuki SEZ in this state by the very same peasantry and the farmers who have resisted this kind of takeover by the oligarchies and the computerized capital that has been imposed on this state. And the second thing, that prior to imposing this model, the fascistization of the Gujarat polity, the way the fascistization, the fascistic and disregard for all the human rights in Gujarat that has taken place over the last 1.5 decades, which has not been really discussed about, that how this model has been made to look successful, at whose cost. And the third thing is that the displacement of the large number of people, which has also been gone unnoticed, and how this computerization has also led to an extreme form of dehumanized proletarianization in Gujarat, and that inequity ultimately making the model itself very unstable.
Thank you. Abhijit will have the last word.
Whereas I take your point on job creation being really critical, what is your take on the MSME sector as being, we had these small-scale reservation systems in the early decades of our independence, and they really ended up distorting a lot of industries horribly. That's where I wonder, there are economies of scale are also equally a reality. How do you balance out encouragement to MSMEs versus being economically viable organizations?
Yes, no, that's where, and I'll begin by the last question again. That's where the idea is certainly not to return to square one, because square one has been tried already and the limitations of what it was has been experienced. So again, it's a reform of the system that is needed. And the idea is not to, again, offer reservations for this or that group, because again, you create trends. Again, it's not at all market-oriented. But some other incentives and support. Loans. How do you finance the SMEs today? That should be a priority. Where should the money of the state goes? In loans to these groups. And the State Bank of India does not need to lend $1 billion to someone who does not need this $1 billion. You see what I mean? There is a real issue there. So for me, that's the priority. And I will pick and choose because I can't do justice to all the questions. There is, if I go back to the beginning of the list, there is a very important one, question on the new middle class and the way this new discomfort with the party they have voted to power will translate politically next time, where we have already seen in the local elections that it has made an impact. The problem will be you know, the demand for reservation is not something opposition parties can take up either. Or you can, but if the Congress says, okay, we will give you reservations, Patels and others. Well, on the one hand, we know that the court will cancel that. And secondly, they may lose the OBC vote. Because if you offer the quotas to Patels, then who are the losers? The Kolis, the Thakurs, the Kshatriyas. So that's where the debate has to be completely shifted. You know, that's where, again, to go back to the reservations and so on is not the solution. And here you need imagination, and we need the young generation to come up and have new ideas, because that's from where the ideas will come. Will it be an Arab Spring? Not really for that reason. I don't see Gujarat as the place where some Arab Spring. No, the situation is so different. You know, I've been to Algeria. I've been to many of these places. You know, the comparison is very, very difficult to make, and for good. And I'm glad it is difficult to make the comparison. No. But certainly to think afresh, you know, a new cycle is opening up in Gujarat. A new chapter has to be written. How can it be something that without revolution, without violence, without excessive demonstrations and so on, how can it unfold itself? Well, that should be the order of the day, and I do hope that the series of lectures we are inaugurating today will be one of the, well, places, one of the crucibles for thinking afresh, out of the box, about all these questions. And I'm really sorry not to be able to respond to all the questions which were already otherwise on the list. No, there is one that I wanted to take up. The question of the new energies, the renewable energies. You know, that is one of the interesting solutions, I mean, ways out. Because there is something I have not mentioned so far, but that you all know, environment is also at stake. And this model has another problem, that it is not environment friendly. So for this additional reason, solar energy, for instance, which is already the order of the day in Gujarat, should definitely be also a priority. And that is good for job creation. This is good for decentralization, because you can have your solar panels. You know, I'm part of an initiative that is Franco-Indian. By the way, the French president will inaugurate the building of the Solar Alliance in Gurgaon next week. And the French are very much thrilled by the outcome of the COP21 on that front. And solar energy is one of the areas where some collaboration is possible. So I've learned, because I had no idea of these things before, that you can certainly activate local solar panels for generating at the village level the energy you need cleanly. One example, a French company, SME, has started a plant on the road between Ahmedabad and Baroda for building tanks for refrigerating milk. The problem is, the moment this milk is collected at the village level, you need a generator for keeping the milk cold before it goes to the dairy. If instead of a generator, you have solar panels at the village level, you create jobs. You know, you'll have many people who will have to install and maintain this. You have clean energy, and you give some empowerment to these local peasants. So this is exactly the kind of innovation, I think, that is growth-oriented, environment-oriented, and generating jobs. So yes, go ahead. And this is one of the directions in which you can definitely go ahead. Sorry, I'll have to leave you at that point.
Thank you, Professor Jaffrelot. May I request Professor Howard Spodek, the first incumbent of Sri Shrenik Lalbai Chair for Management of Social Organizations at the Ahmedabad University, renowned historian and professor at Temple University, to deliver the vote of thanks. Professor Howard.
Thank you very much. It's very easy to give a vote of thanks. That was a very stimulating lecture covering so many subjects with so much data, which we often lack in our discussions, and taking us in very interesting directions. At the same time, I do have a big question at the end. You yourself began, Christophe, to address it, and maybe that's as far as we can go. But some of the data, one question from the floor was, really, why have you gone into these data once again? Christophe gave us information on the growth of positive issues. He said there are some great good things that are happening. One is the growth of the economy of the state, large-scale investments, the growth of large industries, the growth of infrastructure, which you mentioned sort of later in passing. But at the same time, there were some very negative elements of what was going on. The biggest one that you mentioned was a scarcity of jobs and low social expenditures, low on education, low on health. And I thought you might add difficulties with ecological problems, really huge ecological problems in the state because of the kinds of industries that have been developed. And someone said from the floor, well, why did you go back to this information? Here at CEPT University itself, the CUE, the Center for Urban Equality, Darshini Renu Desai, who must be here somewhere, and others have explored these kinds of questions. Indira Hirway has looked at these kinds of questions for a very long time. And why revisit them now? And that's kind of historian's question. Why now? Why look at these again? And he gave a historian's kind of answer. It came out of the reservation issues raised by Hardik Patel and the whole Patel, or some of the Patel community. And that really was of interest to me because it's a political question. And the bulk of the discussion that Christophe gave us did not touch deeply on politics. It did a little bit. Some of the issues that were raised were, how long can inequality go on? And I would add to that, why has it gone on? How has it gone on as long as it has? Because you're saying, well, at some point or another, equality, somebody will revolt in some fashion or another. Why hasn't that happened till now? And what will cause it? How much will the Patidar revolt affect this and other kinds of revolts as well? So how long can inequality go on? And who benefits from it, of course? You didn't really raise that question either, but there are always beneficiaries. Inequality is really beneficial to a lot of people, and they oftentimes see that as a good reason to keep it going. I would also note that Bimmel, in his introductory remarks, talked about the number of books that Christophe has written, and one of them is called India's Silent Revolution, The Rise of Lower Castes in North India. And he joins with many other political scientists who were comparing results in India and China and said, you know, India has not had the kind of root and branch revolution that China, for instance, has had. But it has had small revolutions, 1 million mutinies now. It has succeeded in moving forward politically and economically through local, smaller revolutions, revolutions that worked at smaller levels and have brought enormous transformations in the country. And that's really, in a way, what I was hoping that we would get a little bit later in this talk. And that would include two kinds of questions. There have been two major elections, two important, I'm not sure how major they are, two important elections since Narendra Modi became prime minister, moving the Gujarat model, which I think is not entirely hype. But his use of it is his use of it. And I was actually a little surprised that this four-letter name was not mentioned throughout your talk, because the Gujarat model is so much connected with the prime minister's agenda and his way of putting forth the agenda. There have been two elections of some importance since Prime Minister Modi's election in New Delhi. One was the election in Bihar, which I suppose there are other elections too. I'm looking at the negative ones, which toward the Gujarat model. Of course, there were other elections held as well, which were very, very favorable toward the BJP. But there have been two now: the election in Bihar and the rural elections and small town elections in Gujarat. And I'm wondering what that will mean for the Gujarat model. And here I'm really asking for the political side of what is going on. Most of the information that we've been given has been economic information, with the sense that the trigger for revisiting it has been a political movement among the patidars. It was a very complex movement. So I'm wondering where that will take us. What will come next? Christophe ended, it seemed to me, on a rather optimistic note. I'm not sure everyone would agree. But toward the end, he did say that what will come next? Where will people take this? There has always been change going on, and there are elements that would suggest that there's going to be some positive changes coming out of these silent revolutions, these million mutinies now. And I'm looking, for instance, as I read the paper, as to what Anandiben Patel is doing in Gujarat in response to the poor performance in the rural areas, relatively poor performance in the rural areas of the BJP, and what is going on in the BJP in New Delhi as a result of the elections in Bihar. I don't have to answer these questions, and I couldn't possibly answer these questions. And I don't know whether Christophe said he has a bus. I think he scheduled his bus, so he didn't have to answer these questions. But Christophe has a bus to Ajmer at 7 o'clock. And he said he's going to leave. But I was sitting between the two presidents, the two heads of the universities, and I turned to Pankaj Bhai and I said, you know, this really requires a second election, a second talk to discuss the politics of what was going on. And he said, yes, it does. I said, would you support that? And he said, I think you said yes, he would. And I turned to Bimal on my left. Bimal is usually to my right, but Bimal was on my left this time. And I said, would you support, a return to the politics of these whole issues? And he looked at me a little questioning. He said, well, if you come back, I'd be happy to. So with a great vote of thanks to Christophe for a very stimulating lecture, and a hope that you will come back and be invited back to give another lecture, maybe on the politics of it, I voted a round of thanks. And also I asked Pankaj Chandra from Ahmedabad University to come up and give a token of our appreciation to Chris. And I was told that the last responsibility was to invite everyone to tea upstairs. Thank you.